Since early times, mankind has been plagued with the incurable disease of insanity. We as a people have struggled to find some sort of protection and possibly a cure for people afflicted with this ailment. Realistically, our greatest fear concerning insanity is the creation of a mass murderer. The definition of a mass murderer is a person with homicidal tendencies, possibly due to a mental disorder, that has killed more than three people with a cooling off period in between. All mass murderers, from Jack the Ripper to Jeffrey Dahmer, fit this description. There are simple, important social factors from family to the law that drive normal people to mass murder and insanity. Society's definition of a mass murderer is somewhat different from the legal definition. The legal definition deals mainly with facts and statistics, while society's rests mainly on opinions. These murderers typically are cookie cutter people, so much alike you could close your eyes and be talking to any of them. No one ever suspected Ted Bundy of having homicidal tendencies. The man was very eloquent, had very high IQ, and was said to be the most polite man you'd ever come across. One man arrested for the killing of three people was quoted as saying, "Technically, I meet the definition of a serial killer, but I am an average looking person with a family, job, and home, just like you." The trouble with society's definition is that it's impossible to correctly peg someone as psychotic until after the murders have been committed. The law has a system based on patterns and lives of other killers that has, to an extent, been able to predict where and when a mentally ill individual could pop up and begin to kill. Often, the victims of a killer fit a pattern, but sometimes there is none at all, depending upon the severity of the killer's illness. The legal definition and prediction of a mass murder isn't foolproof, however. The US has seen 150 plus documented cases of serial killers since the year 1800. The rate of solved homicides in 1992 lowered to 64%, down from an astonishing 90% near the turn of the century. The rate is lower due to the decline in police efficiency and the loopholes in the legal system, where a clever murderer or smart defense attorney can jump through. The system is so easy to get around now that even juveniles are able to kill their parents and get off without a scratch. All this is due to the failure to detect a problem before it becomes worse. In order to stop these killers, you must be able to identify their MO, or modus operandi. What they do to their victims helps identify what their specific mental illness is. Ed Gein, whose exploits in the 1950s helped inspire both Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for instance, was very much into human decapitation and mutilation. The legends about him, partly portrayed in both movies, are in such abundance that it's sometimes hard to tell the truth from fiction. John Wayne Gacy, aka Pogo the Clown, favored killing young boys and men. Gacy was suspected of being gay, which partly explained why his victims were all male. After Gacy was apprehended, so many were intrigued by his method and style that they were willing to dial 1-900-622-GACY at $1.99 a minute just to hear Gacy talk about his death sentence. Some lesser-known killers, including Richard Masick and Edmund Kemper. Kemper slaughtered his mother, then invited her best friend over to help him plan a surprise birthday dinner. He killed the friend too, and then cannibalized his mother. Masick committed rapes and rape murder that included stabbing, drowning, strangulation, mutilation, biting, and necrophilia. His attacks were ritualistic. He tied his victims with very precise knots, cut symmetrical lines on their flesh, bit them, and took souvenirs. And who could forget Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, who not only killed, dismembered, and ate his victims, but stored them in freezers for later? Judging by the heavy attention to detail on Masick's part, one might think that he had a problem concerning intricacies. Perhaps his family pressured him into perfection so far to the point that he became obsessed with it, even to the extent of maybe murder? Divorce, abuse, or abnormal childhood experiences can lead to the development of murderous tendencies. For instance, Kemper was supposedly traumatized by a domineering mother. For others, it can be sexual abuse by either parent or even a sibling. Abnormal experiences as a child, such as witnessing a gruesome murder or being party to some sort of cult ritual, can severely influence a budding psycho killer. An expert on the mentally ill, Shervert Fraser, concluded that these killers had been subjected to some sort of brutal treatment that led to hostile, murderous tendencies. Fraser, a president of the American Psychiatric Association and a director of the National Institute of Mental Health, has had patients such as the Boston Strangler Albert DeSalvo. He, among others, has studied the very killers themselves to get some idea of how they work and what drove them to kill. Such answers to a desire to get attention, to be known, were expected. Another answer that was expected was curiosity. One killer at the age of 14 shot his own grandmother just to see what it was like to kill. He then shot his grandfather so that he wouldn't get upset with him. Shocking crimes give excitement and thrills to an otherwise boring life. They are a violation of society's rules, which makes murder look very appetizing to someone who wants to openly defy the world. Sometimes the most obvious reasons of a killer are also the most psychotic. As adults, these abused, neglected, traumatized children are given to gender confusion, chaotic sexual behavior, and cross dressing. The future serial murderer cannot develop the ability to differentiate himself or herself into a separate, distinct personality. Rage, narcissistic lust, and a need for attention drive them. They are overcome by a hunger for power and control, the kind of power and control that come from holding a gun to someone's head. This sort of power leads to the killer getting an inflated ego, which can easily blossom into a god complex. Think about Charles Manson. The murders of Sharon Tate and her friends was the accumulation of Manson's cult philosophy based on the worship of both God and the devil. He exerted total control over the so-called Manson family, which contained mostly women, through repetitious preaching, drugs, and fear. Murders such as these show the killer's desire to be God or like a god. He or she wants to have control of their own lives and possibly others. David Koresh, for example, thought himself to be the Christ. He told his followers that when he was killed, he would rise again to take them to heaven with him. They believed him, themselves possibly drugged or under intense fear. On the other end of the shtick, of course, are those that feel inadequate when compared to other people, resulting in almost an infantile paranoia. Groups of criminally ill people, whether greatly insane or slightly, have oppressed minority groups for their own personal fears. Minorities like blacks, Jews, homosexuals, even the accused witches in Salem, Massachusetts. Like a baby exploring its world, the mass murderer explores his craft. Murder to him or her is no more than like taking apart a clock to see what makes it tick. This sort of childish behavior may come from never making the leap from adolescence to adulthood. Early behavioral problems that aren't solved may end in the individual's insanity. As a child, they will internalize the anger, having then never learned how to resolve such feelings. Then, as an adult, the individual will project out anger and rage into the environment. Their parents may have never let them experience common childhood things like having friends or riding a bike, thus never giving them a childhood. Not only will this result in their resentment of their parents, but also the lack of transition into the grown up world. Of course, the parents are not always to blame. The child may just have been born aggressive. The same results as before can bloom too. They may end up voluble and verbally facile, like Coral Eugene Watts, whose IQ was 75. One criminal displayed his naivete by saying, "When I rob a bank, I notice that the teller shakes. One barfed all over the money. I don't know why." This sort of infantile paranoia even extends to the way that their bodies work. One mental hospital patient actually believed at times that he was sprouting breasts and other feminine features. The inferior complex that many killers have, however, enable them to confuse their pursuers due to the lack of rhyme and reason in their murders. They may not be the most intelligent killers in the world, but as one expert said, they are able to tell unlikely but convincing stories that cast themselves in a good light. If the person believes them, it's like a high. Getting back to the personality of a killer, how might one tell if someone they know might be going off the deep end? Sometimes the most obvious reasons are the most subtle. Most killers are dubbed as charming with a stunning lack of conscience. In other words, their game is self gratification at the other's expense and not caring one bit about the consequences. Manson himself displayed this, as well as being impulsive with poor behavioral controls. Most need excitement and will try to attain this at any costs. But that doesn't narrow it down much. There are many people who are reckless yet are not legally insane. Ted Bundy was labeled as an amusing and entertaining conversationalist, always ready with a clever comeback. But does that in itself make him criminal? The main thing to look for when one is suspected of mental illness are severe personality changes. These changes are obvious, like the most caring person in the world suddenly becoming very apathetic to everything and everyone, from being shy to being open, quiet and law abiding to loud and law defying. A common description included in the profile of the criminally insane includes being superficial and egocentric. An obvious lack of guilt, remorse, or empathy is a pretty good sign that something is wrong. This also works going the other way. If a person's best friend suddenly becomes antisocial and shallow, it would probably be a good idea to look into other areas of his or her life to see if there's a pattern. While it's difficult to predict with certainty whether someone will become a killer, certain factors can contribute to a person's likelihood of committing violent acts. These factors include childhood trauma and abuse, mental health issues such as untreated psychosis or personality disorders, exposure to violence and aggression, social isolation, and lack of empathy. So, how can this be addressed? Well, early intervention and support for vulnerable individuals, and mental health treatment and resources. However, there are no limits for those with somatic illnesses. The trouble is, they may not come out of the hospital as healthy and stable as they should be, and sometimes family members don't want the patient to stay too long. New antipsychotic drugs are dramatically reducing hospitalization for severely ill schizophrenic patients, but even then, medication cannot be solely trusted when it comes to our mentally ill. The more recent ideas include researching other killers to find potential insanity. There have been cases where a murderer that has already been arrested has helped police track down one that had yet to be apprehended. Bundy is one example. He led police to the capture of one killer, correctly advising them to return to where the crime was committed. He claimed that the killer would return for two reasons: one, to relive the crime in his mind, and two, to take with him some sort of memento. And Bundy was correct. The killer did return, and police captured him. With drugs and rehab treatments becoming faster and more efficient, the real problem still lingers. How does one prevent another from becoming the next Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer? We can work towards reducing the likelihood of someone becoming a killer. However, it's important to note that each individual's circumstances, they're unique, and there is no guaranteed way to prevent all violent acts, but we must keep trying. Now, having said all that, and to make things even more complicated or perhaps layered, is that there are cases where individuals have committed murders without a history of mental illness or childhood trauma. And some of these examples include radicalization. Individuals may become radicalized and commit murder in the name of a political or ideological cause without a history of mental health issues or childhood trauma. Cultural or societal influences. In some cultures or societies, uh, killing may be glorified or normalized, leading individuals to commit killing without any history of mental health or childhood trauma. Then you have situational factors like extreme stress, financial hardship, or social pressure can contribute to violent behavior and killing. Even individuals without a history of mental illness or childhood trauma can do that. Narcissistic personality disorder. Now, while not always classified as a mental illness, narcissistic personality disorder can lead individuals to commit murder due to a lack of empathy and an inflated sense of self importance. Calculated or instrumental violence. Some individuals may commit violent acts and killings for instrumental purposes, such as financial gain or achieve a specific goal without a history of mental illness and childhood trauma. And some examples of killers without mental illness or childhood trauma include: we have Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who committed acts of domestic terrorism due to his radical ideology. You also have Dylann Roof, who committed the Charleston church shooting due to his white supremacist beliefs. But again, it's essential to note that each case is unique, and there may be underlying factors that can contribute to violent behavior. However, these examples illustrate that mental illness and childhood trauma are not the sole predictors of violent behavior. So it can be very confusing. We can only hope to reduce killers, but I don't think we can ever stop anyone from becoming one. But still, and I'll say it again, no matter how steep the uphill climb, we should always keep trying. So, what do you all think? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I'd love to hear what you have to say on the comment section. Also, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you happen to like this content. Anyway, I'm Rick Mullinax. This is Burn After Reading, and I'll catch your ass down the road.